Well, thank you all for attending. My name is Victor Liu. I'm an investment analyst at Causeway Capital based in Los Angeles. So the topic here today is effectively leadership in Asia. And we have experts who work and have practiced both in India and China for a long time. I'll do a quick introduction and then we'll just get into some questions. So we have Mihir Sharma, who's an editor for the Business Standard. We've got Kartik Srivatsa, who's a co-founder of Aspada Investment Advisors. We've got Joe Zhu, co-founder of SmartHealth Ventures, and Edward Say, who is the CEO of Feng Advisory. So the first question to the panel, and what we'll do is I'll just have each of you respond for a couple minutes, is just the idea that as both China and India's economies develop and grow, old leadership models, whether they're state-owned enterprises, family businesses, industrial conglomerates, will probably be less and less relevant. So the question to the panel right off the bat is, what models have you seen that have been effective and non-effective in the countries where you guys work? Edward, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, for a long time, when I mean a long time, for the last couple of decades, when people read the reports from the mainstream Western media, the corporation in China, were reported usually as the big SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, and they're large, they are monolithic, they are protected, or they got privileged access because of policy and so on and so forth. And therefore, the reports has been that these enterprises are not innovative, they're staid, they may be big, protected enterprises, but not really getting anywhere. That's the story. The reality is that that's only one part of the story. In fact, it's getting less and less relevant in China these days. Is because over the last 20 years, in particular in the last 5-10 years, that the private sector in China has been growing extremely fast. And some of the most leading Chinese companies now, not only within China, but increasingly in the rest of the world, are actually coming from the private sector. So from that standpoint, the corporate leadership has evolved a great deal, while the SOEs are still around and some of them are still very big and dominant and so on. Really, the most interesting and most exciting sector coming from China are the private companies, who are by definition both entrepreneurial and also extremely innovative, in particular those who are leveraging technology, the tech sector, in particular with the wireless internet and now with the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence and so on. So I say that from China's standpoint, corporate leadership has evolved a great deal. It's becoming very dynamic, very open, very innovative, and many of them are actually well connected with the tech sector here in the US, in particular in the Silicon Valley.
Kartik?
I would, in some ways, replace SOE with family businesses in what Edward said, and in some ways that's the story of India. Historically, India started off as, in some ways, a much more planned economy in the 50s, 60s, and then there was Indira Gandhi, who actually then created a lot of family concessions, and large families then became powerful in India. Because of a balance of payments crisis in '92, India opened up, and for the first 15 years, right, the families that actually created a strong base right from the 70s, they were able to best exploit most of the businesses, right? Except for the IT sector, where given that it didn't involve local political connections or concessions and delivered export services to the world, specifically businesses like Infosys, where say the driver got ESOPs, right? It was one of the few businesses that actually created, in some ways, a wealth sharing economy. But there were some islands of different corporate governance outside the family businesses, but a few of them only. Between '92 and 2005, you probably find a few companies, right? Only after that we've now seen a much more secular trend around new leadership, not just led by technology, but also in reinventing some of the basic services around, say, agriculture, healthcare, education in India, which is primarily a private-led market in India, even in what are public utilities. And we're seeing a lot of the talent that has actually built businesses in MNCs, etc., now finding it acceptable to be entrepreneurs, one, and B, having the right capital as well as backing to start companies and reinvent these models.
Tianyi, Joe?
So, my opinion from a China standpoint is that China is starting to transform, as Edward said, regarding the changes at this point from SOE-dominated, government-owned, to these private corporations. And even in the tech sector, there's a lot of opportunity, innovation, and just raw hustle from a lot of these entrepreneurs and business owners. The aspect, I think, is there's a distinct difference between a lot of what they say is the tier 1, tier 2 cities that have had a lot of foreign influence, a lot of foreign pressure from the aspect of leadership, innovation, and how to really manage in that sense, as opposed to tier 3 and tier 4 cities. And they still are very large conglomerate businesses, family-owned, run very traditionally in that respects, and also very closely tied to the government. I've always, in a lot of my business dealings, in Shanghai, Shenzhen, you can really get by without having to deal with government true control or really bumping elbows with them on a regular basis. But if you're talking from a tier 3, tier 4 city, you have to be able to manage that element. And from a corporate leadership perspective and really training these new generational leaders, it's, okay, you can get by in Shanghai and do that from a foreign entity standpoint, and really there's less government interference if you're a foreign entity, as opposed to if you're trying to set up in Wuhan, for instance, or Nanjing, you're going to at least bump elbows in that sense. And being able to navigate that from a corporate trading perspective is something that obviously they don't teach in the U.S. perspective. But in China, it's a very hands-on approach. And, there's no class that you can take at Beida to say, this is how you manage the government relationships. It's very much, you watch your father do it, you watch your grandfather do it, you watch family members manage that element, and they kind of teach you those dark tricks and little secrets in that sense, which is a very critical piece, and you have to have those mentors. And it's interesting in a sense that China right now is transforming because of the government crackdowns. You're starting to see, I addressed this aspect that there's an issue where you're starting to see a talent gap in the government. There still are very, very talented government officials, foreign educated, very, very brilliant individuals, being from a youth perspective, but the overwhelming youth at this point are seeing, well, my family, my father, my uncles, they're all under massive scrutiny at this point. So their ability to really flourish has diminished in that sense, but they have all these local contacts. So now you're seeing the second generation go into business. So they're using their business relationships, and then a lot of this is tier 3, tier 4 cities where government is able to influence a lot of major money decisions in that sense. So that's what you're starting to see a lot of, but the question is, from that generational gap standpoint, if you're pushing the top talent into the business realm, what about the government realm? Because the SOEs, the government-led businesses, are a very core crux of China's economy. And if you start transitioning that all to the private side, it's either the government needs to loosen control, or essentially they're going to mismanage more often than they do already.
Mihir, do you see the same thing? And what works in India, what doesn't?
Well, the thing is that, as Kartik said, the kind of leadership, corporate leadership that any country needs is very, very closely linked to the kind of economy that it actually has. And the Indian economy is I think it's in a moment of transition. And the transition is happening very swiftly, and it's very difficult to see what the future brings. But as of right now, it's very difficult, therefore, to imagine exactly what a good corporate leadership strategy, a good corporate leadership package would be. I can tell you what it's not. And what it's not is what it used to be in the 1980s. When I was growing up, India's always had a fairly large and influential business press, and my father, who used to work for a private sector company, used to get all these sort of business magazines. And they always used to have these sort of, fawning profiles of business leaders on the cover. And the business leader would either be, somebody who ran a big state-owned company, So, this thing called Bharat Heavy Electricals Limited, which was the big engineering company, and, the guy who ran it, this chap named Krishnamurthy, was always on the cover. Businessman of the year, 1984, 1985, 1986, 1987, right? Terribly run company, but he was, always being praised. And if it wasn't him, then it would be somebody named Tata or named Birla, one of the people who'd sort of been rich for 150 years. In fact, both the Tatas and Birlas first made their money off the Opium War. All right, so this is sort of the people that you saw growing up, and since then the economy has sort of tried to change swiftly, and it hasn't changed sufficiently for a new economic structure to develop, and therefore for a new leadership structure to develop. So I can tell you, that, as I said, the three things that we don't yet have. We don't have independence. So the standard, a true corporate leader would be independent of the government, right? Would be independent, would be able to stand up and say, look, this is what government policy should be, should be brave enough and have a revenue stream independent enough of the government that they don't need to worry about that. We don't have that kind of independence. We don't have corporate leaders who are institution builders, right? So we're constantly in the throes of enormous succession problems, right? We have all these visionary executives or CEOs who are feted for 15 years as great leaders of their companies, and then the moment that they leave, the companies fall apart. And in many cases, they're called back at the age of 75 to rescue the company. The shareholders desperately need them, right? And so they're not institution builders. We can't handle the transition. And finally, the thing is that most of them are not really professional. So we still are living with, the guys who create most value are precisely, the sons or grandsons of family owners, people who are dedicated in a different way. Engineers who are running engineering companies, not professional managers per se. So it's a sort of problematic situation where, because the economy hasn't settled down, we haven't been able to find a proper template.
Got it. Just to follow up on India, Kartik, you were mentioning earlier what you see in sort of maybe the small medium enterprise. What types of business leaders are emerging, and what has not worked in that space?
So again, it is they're just taking off from where Mihir left, right? I think they are small and medium enterprises yet, right? So, and leadership needs a model of scale where someone has succeeded. So we don't still have the Jack Ma's and Pony Ma's in India, because these businesses in India, right, that are in some ways the copycats of the ones that maybe are Alibaba and Tencent, are like bleeding every day, right? And so they're fundamentally not got to a stage where they've got to become evolved businesses that are large, right? And therefore, the small and medium businesses are the dark horses, right? They're trying, kind of bringing in the new age of no legacy. I don't have political connections, and I'm trying to build this on my own. And there's an increasing venture capital ecosystem that's actually backing people without like net worths. But again, it's early, right? So we still are in the small and medium business environment, and that's where a lot of the new leadership around well-trained people looking at the details, building the ecosystem, and also in businesses where the significant involvement of government is not there, right? So they're not in the resources business, right? Or they're not in businesses that have large government contracts. These are essentially consumer businesses where the government is a regulator and you can manage most of these relationships, but it's not you're going to auction for like priced or scarce resources. So I think there is a lot of leadership that's potentially going to emerge from the small and medium enterprises, and hopefully some of them become really big. And then you have the 2 or 3 role models, right, that actually define the next generation of corporate leadership, right? So we're just waiting for the Jack Ma to emerge in India, for instance. Not to say that that's the model of leadership that we want, but in some ways something that breaks from the past and like signals that this is the future.
Edward, you've written about both Jack Ma and Pony Ma in your book. Can you help us understand the audience? What is distinct about them? What are they doing that's so different? And what are some of the big misperceptions about what they do from a leadership perspective?
Well, for a long time, a lot of people in the West, in particular, believe that if you have certain conditions, certain set of conditions, for example, liberty, freedom, freedom of speech, and democracy, and so forth, and therefore it will lead to innovation and creativity, and therefore it will lead to entrepreneurship. That's sort of the linear thinking, right? What I've just heard from both gentlemen from India, as well as our experience in China, actually has provided some very interesting counterexample. Whereas India, by definition, is the world's largest democracy, very bright people. Many of my closest friends are Indians individually. They're incredible. Yet at the same time, listening to the input from the panelists, as well as what I know from just watching how India is performing, from the standpoint of innovation and entrepreneurship, sure enough, there hasn't been a Jack Ma or a Pony Ma coming from India, at least not for now. Yet at the same time, when China was still a quote-unquote authoritarian state, one-party state, in the last 20 years, we've created a Jack Ma, a Pony Ma, and many others, actually, and many others who's also coming along on the way. I think the question is, I can comment, of course, on Jack and Pony individually, but I think a bigger question is, why is that the case? What has caused this? Would this observation or the phenomenon, would this actually violate the presumption that in order to have innovation and entrepreneurship, you have to have this kind of conditions? A lot of people, as you know, criticized on the Great Firewall of China, as relate to internet, because the Great Firewall was viewed as a way to limit the Chinese getting information, limiting, therefore, their ability to innovate and be creative. China has a very poor, and still has a relatively poor set of regulations or legal system to protect intellectual property rights. Therefore, all these are no good. Yet at the same time, as a Chinese, I think what we're now seeing is the most exciting and most explosive period of growth for intellectual innovation in our so-called 5,000 years or whatever 1,000 years of history. This is now, actually. And in fact, it's just the beginning of it. It's scary. And we are now seeing the likes of, Jack Ma, who leads Alibaba, and Pony Ma, who leads Tencent. And this year, as you know, both of these companies has become two of the top 10 largest market cap companies in the world. In the past, the top 10 market cap companies were, by definition, all American companies, and most of them are tech companies. This year, Ali and Tencent have gone into it, and I can say almost with certainty that in 2-3 years from now, they would enter in the top 5. They will be in the camp of an Apple, a Facebook, an Amazon, and so on. And in due course, they could charge. But why is that the case? If a lot of people advocated, for example, foreign education is a must for these people. Neither Jack nor Pony study overseas. People advocate, well, you need to be an engineer. Yeah, Pony is an engineer, but Jack was none. Some people say, oh, you don't need to be an engineer. But Pony was an engineer. He was just so to fit everything into a stereotype, in my view, is oversimplification. What makes really the real reasons why these guys have gone from nowhere 20 years ago to now some of the top, most successful entrepreneurs in the world, not only in China, is that China was hit with a very tumultuous recent history, all the way until the Cultural Revolution. The Chinese were really bad, really down. Chinese had to come back. And they felt bad. All the Chinese felt that they needed to catch up. Second is, of course, the evolution of the Chinese economy, which is big, which allows the ramping up. China has the largest internet population, highly digital, and also there's a lot of money available. Capital is available left and right, angel investing, VC investing, but they were not available before. But when they saw the opportunity, the investors are smart guys. They smelled the blood. They go after it. And then we invest into Ali, into a Tencent, into a Baidu, and now people like DJI, or Didi and so on, when they make tremendous amount of money, they will continue to invest. And those are conditions that enable the likes of Jack Ma and Purnima to come out.
Mihir, I was going to ask you to respond to that and just sort of why do you think there isn't the same sort of vocal public figures in the Indian sort of business community, or who could fill that void in the future?
Well, I think that, I mean, first of all, you have to remember that India-China comparisons, as Edward has just carried out, have to be corrected for the fact that we are, let's say, 12 to 15 years behind China in terms of economic change, right? So we are right now where China was, I would say, in 2001, 2002. And the question that therefore we should be asking ourselves is, as China's economy was beginning to change in 2001, was there an equivalent figure to Jack and Pony? And the answer, I suspect, is no, not quite. And the reason is not because of any other broad systemic reason, but simply because at points of transition, you can't create those figures. I do believe that one thing that is that we have in the creation of these leadership figures and of these, in fact, of these groundbreaking companies in the developing world have in common is that they tend to break out in sectors or in areas where the government is not in full control, or which the government has, for some reason, relatively ignored, all right, or which it has screwed up, right? And I would say, you know, let's say in China, maybe finance is one of those, right? Which is why you have Tencent, all right? So, you know, it would be the case in China maybe that small and medium enterprises access and coordination is one of those things where the government didn't do a good enough job. And so you had space for a smaller company, to become big and giant, the way that Jack Ma did. Similarly, in India, you know, you have information technology as something where the government, you know, it took 20 years to discover it existed. So you had, you know, you never had any regulations, and so you had an IT sector develop that was, you know, world-beating in a particular sense, and so on and so forth. It is where, that's where you actually begin to see new sectors develop, and new individuals and companies and new forms of leadership turn up. So, I mean, I have to sort of therefore slightly disagree with Edward. I don't think it's about, you know, the structure of does it provide free speech and innovation and so on and so forth. It's government has a strong presence in a lot of developing world economies, both in China's currently and 20 years ago, and in India's. And getting out of the, you know, getting away from the hand of government is something where true corporate leadership is allowed to display itself, and where the ability to grow suddenly emerges. And I think that that's the crucial difference. To, you know, to answer your specific point, where will you see these voices develop in India?
Or who they could be.
Yeah, or where they could be. They'll come from places where you do not, in fact, in the future have, you know, where government doesn't have something much to say. The reason why, you know, Jack Ma matters as a voice in China, and we don't have an equivalent in India, is because, you know, Jack Ma has, his company has a tremendous influence on the grassroots of the Chinese economy, right? We don't have a single company like that, except maybe for, you know, Reliance Industries Limited, which is a giant conglomerate. And the founder of Reliance Industries Limited is a very old world man. You know, he's very sort of the socialist economy kind of individual, a man named Dhirubhai Ambani, though he navigated the company's change into liberalization. And he was an extraordinarily popular figure because he had, you know, a rags to riches story. He tried to sell, you know, the idea of shareholding to people. You know, he went from house to house on his little Vespa when he was just starting out, trying to sell shares to people. So we don't yet have a figure like that because we don't have a company that has reach and which affects everyone to the degree that we need to. We have giant companies, but nothing with that kind of reach.
I just wanted to add, so yes, we are, if you take the stock position, right, it's like 2001 of China, right? But will it take like 15 more years? Probably not, right? Because most of the technological deployments around, say, mobile phones, etc., right, they've happened concurrently. What's happened? So India has 300 million mobile phones, right? The thing is that, for instance, 1% of content in India,
smartphones.
right? No, 300 mobile phones with internet connections, right? For instance, right? It has 1 billion mobile phones, but 300 people are connected to the internet, right? But there's 60 million people in India who speak English, right? But there's 300 million phones. 1% of content, right, is outside English. So the rest are just seeing symbols, right, on their phones and like, right? So the thing is that the technology deployment is there. The only difference at this point in India is we are at $1,700 GDP per capita versus 8,000 plus in China, right? So fundamentally, we don't have the purchasing power for some of these services to come. And the other point of it is it's not necessarily tech businesses. In fact, in China, you can say that there's a shadow banking economy and like that's an opportunity, right? In India, most sectors, the government is kind of like not done well, right? Just to be euphemistic on this, right? And therefore, and they have a conscious policy now to move into much more controllable businesses like finance. So for instance, in healthcare or education, the government has an active push at this point to become a payer and not a provider, right? So the government is saying, I'm not going to build hospitals, I'll give you insurance, right? So there are conditions both in terms of reduction of transaction costs because of mobile phone technology, roads, right? We now finally have, so for instance, over the last 12 years, there's 400,000 kilometers of roads that's been added, right? So we have the infrastructure that's deployed now, right? As well as the conditions around government retreating from some of these sectors or doing other things around like putting, so India still spends like 1% of GDP on healthcare, right? And it's just a $2 trillion economy for 1 billion people, right? So that's like $55 a person, right, in a year, right? So there is significant opportunity in India, and it might take maybe a fraction of that 15 years to catch up and maybe create the one Jack Ma. But it all depends on how fast we can grow, right? China had 10% growth for like 15 to 20 years, right? We're still at 7% growth, and it's not shabby, but we feel like it's probably not 15 years. It's probably like 5 to 10 years where you'll see this.
What types of leadership or styles have not worked? So Joe, we've talked about sort of, this sort of authoritarian sort of entrepreneur, but, examples of what you see not working in the country and sort of old styles that will definitely disappear.
Again, I think it differs based on the location. So how I manage employees, or let me actually be clear. I don't manage anybody. My COOs manage people, but they tell me about the problems they have to deal with, and I say either fire that guy or whatever it might be. But the ability to retain talent in cities such as Shanghai and Beijing, where really that's such a grab for talent, has become a difficult proposition. It's very tough to, even just your basic secretaries and people pushing papers get recruited away for bigger salaries. So it's become almost this game of who pays the more for the best talent in that sense. But if you're hiring tech talent, if you're hiring anything of that respects, you have to be in Beijing. It's the major cities that are really attracting that level of talent. That way, from a recruiting perspective, is kind of what you're talking about in the sense that there were very rich Chinese businessmen before Jack Ma. Jack Ma represents a new element of a leadership style where it's basically you have your first Chinese charismatic leader, somebody who's motivating, who's talking about this future dynamic of this is what you have to do in the future to succeed and all this sort. Back then, all these big rich business guys were like, well, you know what, clean up my shit and do what you got to do. And a lot of the 2-tier, 3-tier, 4 cities still operate in that fashion. Because from an economic prosperity standpoint, if you don't have as many options, this is your job, this is your career, you listen to whatever you have to do. I was telling you this story yesterday, but when one of the biggest joint ventures I signed, I'm sitting there at the table with Mr. Wu from Nanjing, the largest playground manufacturer, and then on the side his nephew. And we come up with this idea, and at this point he calls up his CEO and says, get you and all the big staff over here right now. So as we're sitting down, eating, drinking, and brainstorming this idea, he calls his entire staff in. This is like 8 o'clock in the evening. And people are taking notes. They're not eating, they're not drinking with us, they're taking notes. Had you done this, well, frankly, had you done this now in Shanghai, people would be bitching and crying. But had you done this in the United States, HR would be up your ass so fast the next day, you'd be done. So that's the aspect of the flexibility and really the control of the CEO. Now, the issue on the flip side of that is the decision-making process is so top down that, even for us to manage teams, the teams that reach out to me the most out of fear that they might make the wrong decision are the ones in Changzhou and Nanjing. The ones that don't give a shit what I think are out of Beijing and Shanghai. And that's a very unique aspect of the ability to really embrace Western cultures. And what China has what China has proven as of late is that cultures can change very quickly, and acceptances to in foreign cultures and foreign ideas can also change very rapidly. I mean, this is a country that for 5,000 years was a tea culture. Now everyone loves drinking Starbucks. So it, without a doubt, can change on a very rapid basis. And some of the management philosophies and innovations and the inspirational leaders that are required in the future to really motivate the Chinese youth, because we complain about the millennials in China just as much as they complain about millennials here. So it's that dynamic of creating now the next, you have to create the inspirational leader and to motivate people to purpose and to be driven and all this, instead of just saying, hey, listen, here's a paycheck and do a good job.
Mihir, I see you giggling. What is your response? Is it very similar or very different?
It's actually remarkably similar. I think if you're going to ask which particular...
You're supposed to argue with me.
I disagree strongly. However, I disagree strongly, except, the specifics of what I think will not work are very similar to what Joe was saying, which is that in India, you used to have this particular kind of enormously feudal setup, right? Where, and some companies and leaders still work like this, where you were responsible first to the owner, who may or may not even have had an official title, all right, and then to his son, who was God King CEO for life. And then through some kind of strange and incomprehensible to the outside world order, pecking order within the family, like in which his son-in-law came above his second cousin once removed, but you had to keep it in. It was like criminology. You're always trying to work out exactly whose instructions superseded whose instructions. So it was a nightmare to work for some of these family-owned and family-run companies. They would break up in this sort of extraordinary partitions where one section would go to one person and another section would go to another person, even though there would be no logical requirement for it would be logical to keep those together, etc., etc. And if that particular style of leadership, which was essentially feudal and emerged from these old business families that had kept their credit and their businesses very close within the family. That style of leadership is dying out. I'm not saying family holdings are dying out, but the style of leadership associated with family companies has been substantively professionalized.
Edward, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry if I prolong this discussion, but very quickly, you asked the question, what sort of leadership style will not work in China. First of all, there are different types of organizations, as we said, so let's be careful about what we're talking about. The SOEs is one type. SOE is part of the communist system, therefore, the so-called business leaders are really a part of the apparatus. So let's take that part away. The multinationals are also pretty omnipresent in China, but they are also mostly sort of professional managers and so on. They work within the MNC system and so on. So that's another type. Within the entrepreneurial part, which is, in my view, the most interesting, most dynamic, and probably the fastest growth, there are also different types. The older types are what been characterized by Joe. A lot of these guys who were very military-driven, single, senior guy, owner, manager, and dictate and all. So that's one type that we see quite a bit. There's also a lot of these entrepreneurial companies are family-owned, and they could be the dictator, but they could also, of course, have a lot of relatives scattered around. Yet at the same time, I think we're also seeing a couple of other dimensions. Some of the most successful entrepreneurial companies are neither family-owned. Like someone like a Jack or Pony, if they want to put their family members in, they could, but they would not. In fact, they don't have much other family members to put into, and they are highly bureaucratic. The Chinese have now is probably one of the world's most largest proponents of what the Chinese call the partnership system. In other words, developing or diversifying the ownerships of the companies, not only from the primary owner or primary shareholders, into a large number of what they call shareholders. So these are sort of people within the management team, senior team. In Chinese, called 合伙人制度. It's the most pervasive mechanism now in the top-end entrepreneurial company like an Ali or like a Tencent and so on. But what's actually been most ineffective, in my view, within this group of companies are companies who have, for wrong, in my view, they have elected leaders who are very operational. They focus on the details. They look down on the day-to-day basis. They came from perhaps very functional background, like in sales and marketing. And while they're very good in managing the details, they forget about the bigger picture. The companies who really have made it in China in this 10, 20 years are companies who really understand the bigger trends of China and the world, in particular as it comes to technology. People like Jack 20 years ago, he said, I knew the internet is going to change the world, but heck, I didn't know anything about exactly how it's going to change. I don't know, but I know it's going to be changing. So I embrace it. I go to it without knowing much to do, but I give it a try. And along the way, I observe what's going to happen. I observe the discontinuities, changes. I do it before other people do. I am more risk-taking. I'm more daring. When eBay, when Mac Whitman came to China, she wanted to take over the China market in 2003. Without knowing anything about C2C, I would take on him or her. And I could defeat her, and she did, and he did. That's kind of the mentality of the most daring and most successful entrepreneurs in China, and not those guys who are accountants, who count the bins. They say, wow, and so on, right? One of the, let me, anybody of you
Anybody bean counter?
Lenovo?
Lenovo? Yep, the Lenovo, the PC computer company.
Okay.
Yes.
Lenovo is a prime example of how they've lost it. They, as you know, used to be a leader or the leader in Chinese community, bought IBM PC, great, and so on. But where's Lenovo today in terms of valuation? They're nothing compared to Alibaba and Tencent. And that's where the leadership make a difference.
I'm curious, in that example with Mr. Wong, who was I think he was a former party chair. I don't know the history of the head of Lenovo, but was that a government official? Was it a bean counter? Was it just someone who was more?
No. Like so many Chinese companies at the beginning, there were some shares from the government. Actually, not at the top government, but one of the, it's a 社科院, is the, I don't know how to say in English, but it's the, think tank in the Chinese, many levels down, nothing. But they transitioned that entirely into a private company, a little bit share from the government, but really is run by the Chinese company. So as a private company, the leadership was transitioned from the founder, Mr. Liu Chengzhi, into Yang Yuanqing. That was like 10, 15 years ago.
Yep.
And Yang Yuanqing was touted as the Steve Jobs of the day. But if you look at what happened in the last 10, 20 years, it wasn't the case.
Kartik, why don't you respond, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience.
So just to take a point that's like opposite to, like, in some ways what you're saying, is that we truly believe that you require a visionary founder, right? But I think the challenge in India, in some ways, given like Indians love talking and like saying that we're going to do this, we're going to shake the world, is to not have.
China's the same way.
We need to have the bean counter, right? We need to have the operations person, right? And therefore, models that have failed in India are what are known as the cut and paste models, right? Oh, this works in the US, right? Let me like start this here, right? But the challenge is that we don't have the ecosystem, we don't have the value chain built out, right? So it's like, for instance, I'm an app company, but there is no app store, right? So I think most companies have also failed because they've taken this bravado model around, like, let's just build this out, like, and like we can do it and all of that, and they've not really figured out how to build the full stack solution around how can the person pay, right? Can I produce, can I give financing? How can I do distribution, right? Everyone has a great product now, but it's very difficult distributing anything in India, right? So how do you build the solution around financing, around distribution, around product design? And we see that China actually has far more strong operating talent, right? And India has this talent, but we've in some ways, there's been a bunch of companies that have made mistakes around like getting enamored by something that's grown fast and not customizing it to India enough, right? And that's the other challenge to watch out.
You know, the thing is that India is a very high-cost economy, in spite of being a poor country. So every input costs a lot. You know, whether skilled labor or finance, everything is high cost. The only thing that is zero cost is vision. All right. And frankly, we massively, you know, we have 70% vision and 30% perspiration in most of what we do, right? And we take these enormous big bets, and you know, even the largest of our companies, Ratan Tata, right? You know, he took this giant bet a long time ago, about 10 years ago, that our people are going to start driving cars, and I am going to give them a sub rupee 1 lakh car. All right, turned out nobody wanted to buy that damn car. Yeah. All right, great vision, but they preferred a scooter. Yeah. All right, and all right, they either preferred a scooter or they preferred a more expensive car. Why would I take this thing? It looks like a scooter, you know, a 4-wheel scooter. I don't want this. And so vision is you know, only works when it's combined with the ability to manage the extraordinarily complexity of the Indian economy. And most of our corporate leaders have, you know, shown no signs of having that, actually.
Why don't we open up to the audience if anybody has questions? I know I have several more.
Well, look, can I just add one aspect to that? There is one critical piece in China. It's very often, it's not, you know, it's part of it's the reliance on the government to set the vision. So the government sets the vision, the Belt Road Initiative, special purpose towns, whatever it might be on this. Yeah, you go this direction, great. I'll follow and I'll try to make as much money off of you as possible.
Let me just take a stab at that, right? We have 1 billion people, right? So there are people who can like have all of these characteristics, right? Detail-oriented, large vision, methodical planning, know how to deal with India, all of that, right? The key challenge has been that the venture capital ecosystem, the cost of capital versus China, right, is still very early in India, right? It's still a fraction of the money that and the cost of capital has been like prohibitive in India. So we don't see particularly that we can't find someone with the right characteristics, but most of what has come into India as venture capital or private equity has actually followed these models have worked in Silicon Valley, this has worked in Israel, this has worked in China, so let me do that, right? It's only starting to emerge that like, let me find Indian ways to solve Indian problems, but use the best tools across the world. So I would actually say capital has been a significant challenge more than anything else. I think leadership is built, and if you put enough bets, you will get the 4 or 5 canonical leaders of the space, but it's still early from a capital perspective.
Just to follow up on what Kartik says, I mean, with honorable exceptions apart, and Kartik, as I can figure out, is one of them, mostly when capital wants to go to invest in early stage in India, they arrive in 2 perfectly nice, you know, districts of Bangalore, and which will have 17 coffee shops filled with people with MacBooks, you know, streaming stuff in Netflix, and, you know, sort of holler in the middle. Who has a good design for 1 billion people? All right, and you know, none of the people in those enclaves can solve the problems that the Indian economy has, because they're not from the places which their solutions are meant to access. Until capital has been extraordinarily lazy in going out beyond India's very comfortable, well, relatively comfortable metropolitan cities into the places where this sort of giant growth is going to come from, which is tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 towns. Nobody's, you know, camping out in Lucknow or Patna or Visakhapatnam, you know, which are 6 million people, 8 million people, whatever, saying, guys, who here can solve India's problems? I guarantee there's somebody there who can. But capital is not bothering to do it. All right, so that's the problem. If capital has to go out and find these leaders, and they're not even trying.
Edward, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I noticed we only have limited amount of time. I don't want to drag on. But to answer your question, you know, there are numerous number of potential Jack Ma's and potential Pony Ma's around. The fact of the matter is entrepreneurship is getting younger and younger in China. A lot of the entrepreneurs and so-called CEOs, I went to places like this, and people are like in the 30s, 40s, and a lot, even some in 20s. Everybody's a CEO. It's getting younger and younger. Second, as Joe was saying, they are spreading all over, not only in the big cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, and so on. When they go to second tier, third tier cities, the entrepreneurs are over. And they're omnipresent. Everybody's going to try. Why is that the case? And of course, you know, not everybody will be successful. It's a low probability game. Maybe less than 1% of them will ultimately made it somehow. Even less will become a Jack and Pony and so on. But everybody aspires to be the next Jack. Better, actually. Better than a Jack, better than a Pony. And they want to be successful. And that is the momentum. The question, in my view, is, having all the discussion is, you know, why is that the case? Why China have now become this? Because if you roll the clock back, you know, 30 years ago, China wasn't like this. In fact, every day I go and around and talk to the guys, and the young guys come to me and say, oh, you know, this and that and so on. I said, are you smarter than your parents? Are you smarter than your parents? They all quiet a little bit. I said, you probably are pretty smart, but you may or may not be smarter than your parents. Maybe yes, maybe no. But why did your parents not get the chance to become like you are today? Yeah, at least you got a chance, and they didn't have the chance. Why is that the case? It's the conditions. It's the generation difference. And in the past, China didn't have that set of conditions. China now have worked its way, actually accidentally, to create this set of conditions over time. When people were laughing in China, and when China began to open up economically, people say, well, you know, you're low-cost labor, right? You don't have IPR protection. You guys are stupid. You came out from a cultural revolution. You all look the same. How could you be creative? The Chinese didn't bulk. They just work hard. And so the combination of a top-down government direction is, in a way, right, is authoritarian, is really bad from the standpoint of many people. But at the same time, when they set out their mind to do something, they would go for it. And the top-down government direction plus the bottom-up grassroots entrepreneurship, this two combination is what people call the China model. And again, many people, you know, dismiss it. You know, shit, you know, the government controls, no good. You know, we need to have the Washington consensus, got to be free economy and all this stuff, right? But the reality, if you take a step back and look at what happened in the world in the last 20, 30 years, which is the economy has been growing the fastest? Which is the one country that have lived the poverty of people, 1 billion people from nowhere to become now the world's largest middle class? Which is the country who has the fastest growing US dollar denominated billionaire? Which country is that? Which countries now have the fastest growing number of unicorns? Why is that the case? It's the set of conditions. It's the same people. Your parents, Victor. Your parents, Joe, right? My parents. You know, it's the same people. It's the ethnically, it's the Chinese. Ethnically, it's the Indians. When the Indians said, well, we didn't have this condition, that, therefore we can have a Jack Ma, then the question is actually not why. It is what have caused these conditions to appear. And fundamentally, one needs to ask the question, you know, what led to that political system or that set of conditions, right? Geopolitical plus economic. And what is the right system for the right economy at the right time? I think that is actually the question. And I think what happened in China in the last 30 years is just simply incredible. And it's almost replicable because it was the conditions that's available at that time. The question is going forward, what's going to happen in the future?
We'll have to wrap up there. Thank you very much to our panelists for speaking and their expertise. If you have any questions, feel free to follow up with them directly. Thank you very much.